Many people in introducing speakers, many MCs, often begin by saying this speaker needs no introduction. That usually means that they didn't do their homework, and not that people don't know the person. It's with great pleasure that I can use that expression today and mean it. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor B.F. Skinner.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Porter. Ladies and gentlemen, more than 50 years ago, Sidney J. Pressey of The Ohio State University announced the coming industrial revolution in education. A few years before, you can't hear? There isn't by any chance a lavalier mic, is there? No, well, I'll do my best. Remind me, please, if I wander. He had invented a machine which he said not only tests but teaches, and it is shown in the first slide. I hope it's visible without turning down too many lights. I think that you want to all be able to see it. I'll describe it. It's a little box with 5 keys, and you use it with a multiple choice examination. The box directs you to an item. You make your choice by pressing a key. If you press the right key, the little box moves on to the next item. If it isn't right, you press another key, and the second time around, the box stops only at the items you missed the first time. And when you got through, it issued a small ticket indicating that you had been successful. I did not know of Pressey's work when, in 1953, at the University of Pittsburgh, at a meeting there, I demonstrated a different type of machine. That's shown in the next slide. It is a box with a roll of paper that passes from one side to the other, exposing a square area on which a problem, say in arithmetic, can be printed. There are some holes in the paper, and by moving sliders, the student can cause figures to appear in those holes. He then turns the knob on the front, and if he has set the sliders correctly, the paper moves a new problem into place. If he has not done that, it won't turn, and he must reset the sliders. I think the next slide shows that box in use with the student. There it is, yes. He's working on the box. This was to teach arithmetic. A very few years later, IBM made for me a large and much more impressive machine on the same principle. That's shown in the next slide. That's a machine that will teach both arithmetic and spelling because there are letters as well as figures on the sliders. That is a pre-silicon computer, in a way. The problems that are on that could be put on a microcomputer, a home computer now very easily. In fact, there was an ad for a computer which shows a young girl solving just that kind of problem in essentially the same way. That kind of machine wasn't complicated enough for the kind of material I wanted to teach in the course I was giving. You can't have my Harvard students move sliders to compose answers. So I made a different type of machine shown in the next slide. The material is printed on a disk, on radial pie-shaped sections of a disk. And the student puts the disk in the machine and closes the cover, and the next slide shows him at work. The disk is exposed in one small area. There's a problem there, a question to be answered perhaps, or a statement to be completed. And the student writes the answer in a slip of paper exposed at the right. Then by moving a lever, he covers what he wrote under a transparent cover so we can see it but can't change it. and uncovers the correct answer in the rest of the little pie-shaped area. If he's right, he moves this letter to one side, and that punches his answer, revealing that he did call it right, and he moves on, and as in the pressing machine, next time around, only those items on which he was wrong turn up. That machine was used in my course for many years at Harvard, given the Seaver Hall and the Harvard Yard. The next slide and the last slide shows a section of that self-instruction room, which I think was the first in history. Now, these machines are, of course, way out of date now. This can all be done so much more easily with computers. These are a sort of coelacanth dredged up from the distant past, and they are museum pieces, and perhaps it's appropriate that all the machines I have shown you are now in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. Well, meanwhile, my colleagues and I had worked on other kinds of programs, and it turned out that we were teaching about twice as much the same time and effort as before. And other people picked this up very quickly. Other machines were made and programs were written. By 1962, less than 10 years after I first demonstrated that machine, according to an editorial in Science, there were 250 math courses available, 60 science courses available, 25 in electronics and engineering, 25 in foreign languages, 120 in social studies. Now, the machines weren't reliable or good, and most of them were printed in workbook form. Many of them were really excellent. Some of them were bad. There was a popular push to sell them in encyclopedias and so on, but bad programs were written in great number, but some were excellent. A colleague of mine told me that he felt that he really ought to know more about biochemistry, and so he had purchased a program textbook in biochemistry, which happened to be a very good one. And he said, well, it was amazing. He said, in 1 week I knew biochemistry. Well, he didn't mean that he was an expert biochemist by that time, but it was obvious that he had learned an enormous amount in a very short period of time. Now, the whole idea of programmed instruction had caught on and was taken up immediately by industry, but not by schools. It was as if someone had shown Detroit how to build automobiles in half the time at half the cost, and Detroit had said, no thanks. Now, why could that possibly happen? Well, of course, the machines were crude. There were no consistent standards, no good tests. The calculating machines of the time were crude too, but they were used. They could have been used, and text could have been used in place of machines. Too many people would have had to be convinced that the change would be made. Administrators, teachers, boards of education, parents, and so on. But that certainly could have been brought about. Teachers, of course, were a bit afraid of losing their jobs, but that was a mistake. There was no real Luddite movement of destroying machines because they were usurping hand labor and so on. The machines would have done the more unpleasant chores of the teacher, giving the teacher much more of a chance to talk with students and do the kinds of things that only a person can do. Not all of education can be turned over to machines. There were better reasons, however, I think, why these things did not move into the schools. First place, an enormous administrative problem would rise if you did teach twice as much in the same time. If you taught in first grade what is now taught in first and second, what would the second grade teacher do? Well, he or she would have to teach what is now taught in third and fourth. And of course, all the students would then come on the job market at a very early age. And that would cause a good deal of trouble. However, the real solution to that is quite simple. Teach them a lot more. Students aren't taught very much in a 12-year program through high school. And if you could teach twice as much, why not teach them twice as much and bring them on the market at the same age? With another problem, though, if you allow the individual student to go at his or her own rate, and that's a very important feature of this, what happens to the homeroom? What happens to the grade? Some students will move very fast, as they should. They don't want to be held back and bored. Others will take a lot of time, but they will eventually get there. But nothing like a group of students of the same age as a class or the occupants of a homeroom would be likely to survive. Now, these were real problems, but I hate to think that educators simply looked at a way of improving teaching and at the problems it would raise and had said, no, it's not worthwhile. Because teachers, educators do want to improve teaching. I think there's a better reason, and that is they didn't really understand the theory and the experimental practice which lay behind programmed instruction with or without teaching machines. And they were encouraged in that by a digression that occurred at just that time. When Russia sent the Sputnik around the world, the first man-made satellite, Americans were stunned. How could the Russians have beaten us? Something must be wrong with our instruction in mathematics and science. And the National Education Act was very quickly passed. Money was available to improve teaching. A famous conference was held at Woods Hole, and it was reported in Jerome Bruner's book, The Process of Education. I attended one of the meetings of that conference, so I know it at first hand. The gist of it was that teaching had to change. Students were no longer to be taught facts. They were to grasp ideas. They were to create. They were to think for themselves. And when it came to mathematics, they were not supposed to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Little hand computer would do that. They were to think the way mathematicians think in the new math. Well, you know what happened. Enormous amounts of money were spent preparing teaching materials. Professor Zacharias at MIT, for example, spent $1 million or more on just material to teach high school physics. 25 years later, tests showed that grades in high school science and mathematics were slightly worse than they had been. No progress had been made whatsoever. Now, that was I think, a great digression and thoroughly concealed the advantages that would come from a different kind of analysis of what teaching is all about. The teaching machine movement flourished when certain principles were applied to the design of educational material. Some really new processes of learning had been discovered, and they were now being used. That was the result of research in what is called the experimental analysis of behavior. Rather than try to tell you something about that laboratory work, I will describe a demonstration of one of his basic principles. Many years ago, I published a small article in the Scientific American called How to Teach Animals. And I explained how to apply the principles of reinforcement to bringing about changes. And I suggested trying it with one's own pets at home or with one's children. And Look magazine, Look was a picture magazine at the time. Most of you will remember it, I hope. They sent a reporter. He walked into my office one day and said, Look magazine is challenging you. If you can teach a dog to do a very complicated trick as quickly as that, they want pictures. Well, that was a reasonable challenge. I said, yes, go and buy a dog, and I'll tell you what to do. Well, they bought a beautiful Dalmatian.